Good evening, councillors, staff, ladies and gentlemen. We wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We would like to pay respect to the elders of the Noongar Nation, past and present, who have walked and cared for the land, and we acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contributions made to the life of this city and this region. I declare the council members' briefing session open at 6:02 or 18:02 if in the 24-hour clock. Please note that the audio proceedings of tonight's meeting will be live broadcast online with the exception of matters discussed behind closed doors. That broadcast will remain available via the City of Wanneroo website following the conclusion of the meeting. Attendances, we have one leave of absence, which is Councillor Berry, and Councillor Miles is an apology this evening. Deputations, we have no deputations this evening. None have been received. Announcement, declarations of interest by council members, including the nature and extent of the interest, are to be made at the commencement of an item to which the interest relates. Declaration of interest forms are to be completed and handed to the Chief Executive Officer. Item 3, reports, planning and sustainability. Mr Singh, would you like to speak to any of your reports this evening?
Thank you, Mayor. There are no reports from planning and sustainability, but from assets, I have 2 reports.
Hello, Mr Assets, Mr Singh.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Singh. You can talk to us on assets, please.
I got 2 reports from Assets Directorate on the agenda tonight. They're operational reports. I'm happy to answer any questions on both items.
Thank you. Do I have any questions on item 4.1? Yes, Councillor Baker.
4.1 and 4.2 or just 4.1?
We will deal with 4.1 first before we progress to 4.2. Councillor Baker, 4.1. Anyone got any questions on 4.1? Yes, Councillor Parker.
Just a quick one. The main sports pavilion, the storerooms, have Little Athletics been, are they being communicated with as to is this going to be enough for them? Because I know that they did have a lot of problems with their storage at Ridgewood, and when they were moving to the new one, the storage problem came up again.
Mr Singh?
Through you, Mayor, my understanding is our community facilities team has been in touch with the various user groups and identified the requirements, and those requirements reflected in the design which has been tendered out.
Thank you, Mr Singh. Any other questions? Yes, Councillor Sangelli.
My question's in relation to under risk appetite statement on page 4, the second paragraph. Can you please tell me what the commercial opportunities are that are going to be explored at Halesworth Park?
Mr Singh?
Through you, Mayor, I'll have to review that section and provide a response to council members.
Thank you, Mr Singh. Any other questions on this item? If there are no questions on this item, I'll move to item 4.2, repeal of verge treatments protective devices policy. Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, through the chair to Mr Singh. Mr Singh, I note that in the second paragraph under the heading detail on page 6, of course, the intention is to repeal the policy, correct, and replace it, to use vernacular, with thin air, but nonetheless rely upon a management procedure that's referred to in the second paragraph under detail, and it says also using a new management procedure. Is it possible to get a copy of the current existing management procedure and the proposed new management procedure before the new management procedure is endorsed by the city, please?
Mr Singh.
Through you, Mayor, I'll be happy to provide that management procedure on the hub before the next week.
Thank you, Mr Singh. You have another question, Councillor
Yes,
Baker?
thank you, Madam Mayor.
Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Once again to Harminder, if I can, please, Harminder. In the same paragraph, paragraph 2 under the heading detail, it uses, seems to use as one of the rationales for repealing the policy the fact that there's only been one application for protective treatments since 2019. Is that a test that's often used in repealing policies?
Mr Singh.
So what if there's only been one application since 2019? Is that one of the criteria in determining whether or not to repeal a policy, please?
Mr Singh.
Through you, Mayor, when we reviewed this policy, we came up with this proposition that given the policy hasn't been used, and also it is more of an assessment which is done by our officers, and we can manage that in amendment procedure. It doesn't need a council policy. This principle or this practice may not apply to all policies, but certainly in this one, this is our view that we can manage these matters under a management procedure.
Thank you, Mr Singh. Councillor Baker, I'll give
thank
you
you.
one more question before I go to Councillor
Sorry, I
Wright.
don't mean to hog the microphone, I apologise. The other thing too is that there's been one application, but that doesn't mean that there are not, as we speak, residents using protective devices to protect council verges, particularly verges that they have lawned and reticulated and maintained. I'm just a bit concerned that perhaps we're jumping the gun a bit too soon. I think perhaps it might be considered at least just determining how many of these protected devices are, and whether whatever devices they are, such as bricks, rocks, spikes, God knows, whether or not they are prevalent in the community. And simply, it's a case where one application has been received, but there are hundreds of unauthorised protected devices currently in use.
Thank you, Councillor Baker.
Through you, Mayor, this policy, obviously, when we receive an application, this policy is designed to assess and provide consistent approach. If residents or the property owners are placing unauthorized structures and we do get complaints, then we will consider the compliance requirements and how we can then manage that one. As I said earlier, the policy primarily applies when we do receive an application. The intent of this policy when this was first brought in was primarily for the commercial areas before it was expanded to residential areas. The issue with the commercial areas is generally parking of larger size vehicles on the commercial properties, especially in Wangara. That's where it started. But given that we haven't had those issues reported and policy hasn't been used from that point of view, we consider that policy is not required. If we do get a request for a consideration, we can definitely manage that through a management procedure.
Thank you, Mr Singh. Councillor Wright, you have a question?
Thank you, Mayor. My first question was answered, as one of them was Councillor Baker's questions. The other two was, can administration explain what communication was done with the community around this policy, considering the low number of applications?
Thank you, Mr Singh.
Through you, Mayor, like all our other policies, these policies are available for public through our website, and all the standard drawing reference in the policy are also available on the website. If we do get inquiries, we provide that information to members of public. But in this particular case, as the report outlines, we haven't had any for the last 4 years.
Thank you, Mr Singh. Councillor Wright?
Thank you. I've got one more question. Currently, I've had a resident, for example, I'm assisting with, who's had issues with people parking on verges, and through a CRM response from administration, the policy wasn't offered to the resident. Instead, a reference to the city's parking local law was given, and to call the city's rangers to attend the site. Is administration actively promoting this policy when inquiries are being raised?
Mr Singh?
Through you, Mayor, not to that extent the way Councillor Wright has outlined. As generally, parking in residential areas is dependent upon how people are parking in those streets. Generally, what the parking requirements are, they need to be able to park within the driveways, provided it's safe for the rest of the traffic to use it. They can park partially on the verge if there is no restriction or parking prohibitions. So this policy was designed, intent was to provide physical barriers such as bollards, mainly in commercial areas. In residential areas, the options of those bollards is very, very minimal. The reason for that is that generally along the intersection we'll have a raised curb, a barrier curb or a semi-mountable curb. In that case, the intention for that one is for vehicles not to park on those close to intersections. Through the straight stretches of roads where the curbs are mountable, the intention is for vehicles to park provided it is safe to park. So that's where the parking law comes into place, rather than providing physical barriers in residential areas, which can create a safety hazard instead.
Thank you, Mr Singh. Councillor Sangali.
Similar to Councillor Wright's question, I've also had similar occurrences throughout my time on council where I've had complaints in both residential and commercial areas, and I can't recall this policy ever being offered up once in any of those instances. And I would like to seek some clarification on whether or not when a parking complaint comes in, whether or not it is handled just directly by the Rangers team, or does it actually go through to infrastructure for assessment as well?
Mr Singh.
Through you, Mayor, I need to seek some assistance from our Director of Community in place if she's aware of any of those issues being dealt by Rangers only, or they're coming through to traffic services.
Ms Terralink, thank you.
Through you, Mayor, generally speaking, the parking issues are dealt with in accordance with the local law, rather than being referred to traffic services for the application or potential application of this policy.
Thank you, Ms Terralink. Do you have any more questions, Councillor Sangali? No. Okay, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry, I had one question that just came up. In regards to that, if we were to revoke this policy, currently the only mechanism that's left through the local law is if a resident applies and makes an application for a signage on their property, say for unauthorised parking without the owner's permission, that would be the only mechanism left, and residents wouldn't have any other avenue. Is that correct? Currently, with all our policies and procedures around that, only the parking local law would be the only mechanism to go through.
Mr Singh.
Through you, Mayor, should residents feel that there's a parking is creating any safety hazards in that particular street, we can assess it from traffic safety point of view as well and consider parking prohibitions. That is purely from traffic safety point of view.
Councillor Baker, do you have another question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. My question once again through the chair is to Mr Singh. Mr Singh, given that this policy was approved by the City on 23 September 2003, some 20 years ago, why is it now that in its 20th year you believe it's appropriate to repeal the policy in circumstances where it will be substituted by a document titled a management procedure, particularly in circumstances where procedures are normally invoked when there is a policy. So the policy implements the procedure, the procedure implements the policy. And surely since 2003 there must have been, I assume, I don't know, to date, scores of applications under this policy.
Councillor Baker, that's a very similar question from one of your earlier questions. I'll allow Mr Singh to respond to that, but remember it's different questions on the item. Thank you.
Through you, Mayor, yes, policy was first prepared in 2003. It has been reviewed and continuously presented before Council for review and adoption. But given that the recent review has highlighted that policy is not being used, instead of having this policy, should the circumstance arise, administration can deal it with under the management procedure.
Thank you, Mr Singh. Are there any other? Yes, Councillor Sangali.
Probably a rhetorical question, but how effective will a management policy be if the information isn't coming through to infrastructure in the first place?
Mr Singh.
Through you, Mayor, again, the issue will remain. We got verge treatment guidelines as well, which define how people treat their verges. They are again the guidelines. They are not under the policy or under the local laws. Similarly, for these particular matters, when we receive inquiries from members of the public and they indicate what form of barriers they can or what form of physical structure they can place in the verges, in their front verges, that's where we can then guide them through that these are the provisions. We can consider their application for, if it meets the safety requirements and our approved standard drawings, then we can consider their application.
Thank you, Mr Singh. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry, one more question. On the revocation of this policy, if we were to remove this, which is a public document, and we start referring to management procedures, which is a private document, how can we inform residents of that as management procedures? Not even individual councillors can request this because I happen to fall into that category at some point. So how will residents be able to know and inform themselves when making applications if we have no public document to reference what types are available to them and how to go about it?
Mr Singh.
Through you, Mayor, we can actually make a reference of this in our verge treatment guidelines, which can then provide that information to members of the public.
Thank you, Mr Singh. Are there any? Yes, Councillor Baker.
Yes, just a supplementary to Mr Singh. If that's the case, will the verge management guidelines be amended accordingly And of course, there is an old maxim in the law that ignorance of the law is no excuse. The only exception is where the law cannot be known. I think the issue is this, that if the policy cannot be known because it's repealed, it does not exist, but there's a quasi-policy document known as a management procedure. If the public cannot access that, how can they possibly know what the law and guidelines are? Thank you.
Mr Singh.
Through your mayor, the words treatment guidelines are provided to all new residents who come to the city as part of when they construct new dwellings. That the copy is provided to them. And also words treatment guideline brochures are available through our customer service. I need to confirm, I'm pretty certain they are also available on our website as well. So there is enough public information available on words treatment guidelines.
Thank you, Mr Singh. Is that all the questions on this item? If so, thank you, Mr Singh, for this evening. I'd like to move on to community in place and item 4.3, community facilities. Ms Terrelink, welcome back.
Thank you, Mayor. There are 4 items this evening from Community and Place, and I was proposing to briefly introduce item 4.6 initially. So in terms of item 4.6, the City has had in place the local emergency management arrangements in accordance with the legislation since 2012, and the arrangements have been reviewed once during that time and are due for review again. In terms of the changes that have been made, noting that the local emergency management arrangements actually are quite a dynamic document. So as we encounter particular emergency situations, we may update the arrangements as required. However, we are required to do an official 5-year review. So page 31 of the report actually identifies those changes that have been made to the local emergency management arrangements. Which includes acknowledging that we now have some temporary animal relocation sites identified. It does update the schools and the daycare centres that are included. It also has some new versions of the aged care arrangements that we have with the aged care facilities that are in the city, and a few other updates that we've made as well. In terms of the process, what we're required to do first is to put the changes that we're looking to make through to the District Emergency Management Advisor, and as you'll see from the report, the changes that we're proposing to make to the LEMA have been supported, and we've received very positive commentary on the changes that we're proposing. What will happen from there is after Council has endorsed them, they will then be noted by the District Emergency Management Committee and then by the State Emergency Management Committee as well. So this is the 5-year review of the LEMA, and the changes are as outlined in the report. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Ms Terrelink. Do I have any questions? Yes, Councillor Huntley.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I've just got a question. On page 52, on 736 and 7.35, you use the word Barbara Gallo for the WA Sporting Car Club. That's now actually Car Co. Raceway. So they've obviously that's been changed now. And the other question I had was in Annexure 1 on community demographics, point 19. I know you said you would be updating things, but I see that we're using population census of 2016. That's 8 years ago. So I just wonder whether that should be updated, because that really, especially when you look at 85 plus, that actually is totally incorrect now. So I think that perhaps could be updated a bit. But they're the only 2 things that I found in the report. Other than that, it is a very good report, and I was very pleased with it.
Thank you, Councillor Huntley. Ms Terrelink.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. We can certainly make those changes prior to the report coming back to Ordinary Council next Tuesday.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. I've tried to keep them in sets of 3 to make it easier for you. So for 4.6, I noticed on page 58 we don't have any flooding or tsunami mentioned in the table, but it is referenced throughout the document. So I thought I'd bring that to your attention. But my
Ms
main...
Terralink, if that's your first question, Ms Terralink, would you like to respond to that?
Through you, Mayor. Sorry, could I just seek clarification on the question there?
On page 58, sorry, I don't have the page up with me. So on page 58 of the actual report, there's a chart table. Sorry, I'm just trying to get it up now.
Is that still?
Sorry, yeah, page 58 of our agenda. There was a chart that had the potential authorities on there, the description of emergencies likely to occur, 10.2. There's nothing that mentions anything about tsunami or flooding, but it's referenced throughout the documents.
Ms Terralink?
Yeah, through you, Mayor. My understanding is that these are the hazards that are likely to cause an emergency within the City of Wanneroo. So these are, if you like, the identified priority hazards, notwithstanding that the local emergency management arrangements would obviously be used for a range of other emergency situations as well. But these are the ones that are identified as the major, if you like, hazards that are likely to occur within the city.
Thank you, Ms Terralink. What's your other question?
Thank you, Mayor. On page 67, it outlines evacuation centres. Can administration provide more information around building requirements for evacuation centres? I notice in reading the WA Community Evacuation in Emergency Guidelines by the State Emergency Management Committee, 3.2 of that report, shelter considerations around suitable locations, 4.12 risk management around building characteristics, and 4.23 shelter in place warnings. I only raise these concerns because of the state and condition of the Wanneroo Recreation Centre and the consequences of having this as an evacuation centre with old infrastructure that is not fit for purpose, with old kitchen facilities and many other factors which would be a disaster. Will administration consider using reserves or a loan to upgrade the rec centre to be more fit for purpose for both community use and emergency purposes?
Ms Terralink?
Through you, Mayor, as you would be aware, we're currently in the process of looking at the redevelopment of the Wanneroo Recreation Centre, and that can certainly be included as part of the work that we're currently undertaking.
Thank you, Ms Terralink. Councillor Wright?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Ms Terralink. My last question is a general question around evacuation centres. In times of need, such as the Anships fires back in 2020, will administration consider training for council members to be able to volunteer and help at evacuation centres by facilitating our leadership role as elected members? I believe as local leaders we should be on the ground helping out as residents know who we are.
Ms Terralink?
Thank you, Mayor. The lead agency for welfare is actually the Department of Communities. It's not the City of Wanneroo. We could make some suggestions to the Department of Communities, but they're the lead agency for welfare. We do have city staff who assist at the welfare centre or the evacuation centres if we're requested, but at the end of the day, the lead agency is the Department of Communities.
Mr CEO, did you want to speak to that item?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. No, I think the Director provided a comprehensive answer. I guess it's important in terms of emergency, but to have absolute crystal clarity over roles and responsibilities. So the lead agency determines how to run and operate the evacuation centre. In the City of Wanneroo, in elected members' context, our Mayor has obligations under our LEMAC and DMAC for communication on behalf of Council to the community in an emergency environment. I think in addition to what Debbie said, it's a very structured environment when you activate an emergency evacuation centre, and clarity of roles is exceptionally important.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Are there any other questions? Yes, Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through the Chair to Ms Terralink. Debbie, regarding the CSRFF funding application in respect of the Kingsway Little Athletics
Councillor Baker, we're talking about the local emergency management arrangements. We haven't got to that item yet. Do you have a question about the 5-year review of the local emergency management arrangements?
Sorry, Madam Mayor, I was following the chronological order as per the agenda. I apologise.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. I'll go through the items from top to bottom, except for 4.6, which you've done. Item 4.3, Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries Funding Round Outcomes. Councillor Baker, that was what you had a question about?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Sorry for following the agenda in order. But in a nutshell, yes, Ms. Terling, I note that the requested grant was in the sum of 162,000. The department, or DLGSC, has in effect cut that in half down to 80. In these circumstances, when this happens, is it usual for an explanation to be provided by the DGLSC as to why the reduction is approved as opposed to the full amount? Is there a rationale that's mentioned, or is it simply you're told winner, loser, amount, done?
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Ms Terrelink.
Yes, through you, Mayor. Noting with this application that we did actually previously put it in for CSRFF and we were not successful in getting any funding. This time we have received partial funding. The usual explanation that we would get from the department is that there's an oversubscription of the funding that's available. So given that, they obviously would indicate that the project has some merit, but when it competes with all the other project requests, it's normally around the level of funding that's available.
Thank you, Ms Terrelink. Any other questions about this item? If not, I'll move on to item 4.4, Rotary Parks Play Space Upgrade, Consultation Outcomes. Yes, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. 3 questions on this item. In the report, it mentions the removal of the Liberty Swing back in 2018 due to increasingly frequent maintenance and access issues. Why did administration need to lock the swing all the time? Was there an opportunity to use smart technology such as a self-timing lock?
Ms Terrelink.
Through you, Mayor, I may need to ask the Director of Assets for some assistance with that question.
Mr Singh.
Through you, Mayor, no, that wasn't considered in 2018.
Thank you. Do you have another question, Councillor Wright?
Yes, my last question, sorry, I had 2 questions for this one. What would the cost to reinstate the Liberty Swing as part of this project while the park is closed during construction?
Ms Terrelink.
Through you, Mayor, it hasn't been part of the concept design that's gone out to consultation so far, but we could certainly get some figures around what it would cost to include that into the project, noting that we are proposing to also develop an all-abilities playground in Clarkson as well with state government funding, but we can certainly do some research to understand how much it would cost for another Liberty Swing.
Thank you, Ms Terrelink. Do I have any other questions on this item? Yes, Councillor Sangelli.
Just under the financial costs there, I note that there's 1.1 million being spent over a number of years. Is there any state or federal funding being attributed to that?
Ms Terrelink.
Through you, Mayor, no, I understand that this is actually being funded through the asset replacement or asset renewal reserve, but so far we haven't applied for any funding for this particular upgrade.
Councillor Sangelli.
Has the city considered putting commercial development on there to actually bring some money back in? Because apparently all our parks need to make money now.
Ms Terrelink.
Through you, Mayor, I believe through the Director of Corporate Strategy and Performance, we have previously endeavoured to have a pop-up coffee van or facility on the site. However, we didn't receive any interest, I understand, when the expression of interest for that was done.
Thank you, Ms Terrelink. Councillor Sangelli.
Have we considered offering acreage or hectares for a commercial development?
Ms Terrelink.
Through you, Madam Mayor, not as far as I'm aware at this point in time in terms of this particular site. Obviously, with the redevelopment of the Wanneroo Recreation Centre, we have considered whether there might be commercial opportunities as part of that.
Thank you, Ms Terrelink. Ms Smith, would you like to speak to this item?
Thank you. On page 23, I just looked at one of the bullet points questions from the survey. What has motivated the need for more fencing for this park? I didn't see an answer to that on the right. If you could expand on that, please.
Through you, Mayor, I think it's the issue is related to safety and the fact that the playground is actually relatively close to the water. So the requests that we've received previously from residents is that we do look to fully fence it so that young children can't escape, if you like, and potentially get close to the water.
Thank you, Ms Terrelink. Councillor Rowe.
Thanks, Mayor. On page 23, the same person who lodged comments asked whether council had contacted Burbridge School. The bottom paragraph on administration's response indicates that correspondence was sent out and they were invited to provide feedback. Do we know if any of the schools mentioned in that bottom paragraph actually did provide response to the city's consultation?
Ms Terrelink.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll take that on notice and we will include the information in the report for next week.
Thank you. Are there any more questions on this item? If there are no more questions, I'll move to item 4. Oh, Councillor Smith, you haven't one. Sorry. Councillor Smith.
Thank you. Just having some dealings with Joondalup Council with their parks about fencing as well. Do you consider some of the research that says fence parks see a reduction in supervision by parents about their children in those areas? So I know it's a great thing for when there's water and risks, but is there a procedure or process that you follow when you're weighing up whether to fence or to not to fence?
Ms Terrelink.
Through you, Mayor, I'll take that question on notice. Thank you.
Are there any more questions on this item? If there are no more questions, I'll go to item 4.5, petition PT 011122, election signs on road verges. Do I have any questions to this? Councillor Rowe?
Thanks, Mayor. 2 questions, if I may. They follow on from each other. I'll ask them individually. The first question is referring to the date that's provided, which is the second quarter of 2024, is when some action is expected on this due to conversations that need to take place throughout the year. Ms Terrelink, does that mean that the existing local law and the existing compliance measures will be in place for the October 2023 local elections?
Ms Terrelink.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, so certainly the signs local law will remain in place as it is at the moment. In terms of compliance, given the issues around freedom of speech, the approach that we're taking at the moment, which is around if the signs are placed in areas where it creates a safety issue, the signs will be removed. Otherwise, we use an education approach and encourage compliance with the local law.
Thank you, Ms Terrelink. Councillor Rowe.
Thanks, Mayor. And just following on from that, the second question, under the current arrangements of education over compliance, for the purpose of clarity, does that not include infringements for illegally placed signs, rather just a collection fee for those who choose to go and collect signs that have been taken away because they were illegally placed?
Ms Terrelink.
Through you, Mayor, the practice has been that we do have an impound fee if those signs are to be collected. We very seldom use the infringement approach.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Treby, you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and it's fairly similar in following on from Councillor Rose. I just have some difficulty in correlating the approach and the local law with the risk appetite statement. So my first question is, what analysis has been undertaken by administration to determine that the strategic implications and a risk appetite statement effectively apply to the request emanating from the petition?
Ms Terrelink.
Through you, Mayor, the risk appetite statement obviously relates to the overall strategic goal number 7. So while it applies in this particular instance, I would say that we haven't done the direct analysis on this particular issue. Rather, it's the strategic objective goal that relates to this particular petition. As council members will be aware, there is further need for conversation around what we're going to do in the space of signage in the public realm, and that requires further consideration by council. So the intention of this report is to acknowledge that the petition has been received and that we will consider, given that the petition obviously relates to the issue about signage in the public realm, we'll consider that as part of the review that's currently being undertaken.
Thank you, Ms Terrelink. Do you have another question, Deputy Mayor Treby?
do, thank you, Madam Mayor. And I raised that question just in respect of the application and relationship with the strategic implications, because I'm not sure that the risk appetite statement mirrors the current administration approach of impounding signs. That doesn't appear to be a medium level of risk. That would, to me, suggest that there is an action by administration if those signs are being impounded to working at a different level of risk than is stated in this report. I'd suggest that what may be the case is possibly before next week's council meeting is a review of the appetite statement, because I suspect from the council's perspective and my view of risk management in this space, it's much more likely to be as low as is reasonably practicable in terms of risk, which would impart a higher level of compliance on this matter. I suppose what I'm saying and asking, do you believe the alignment to strategic implications and also the associated risk appetite statement matches the report and the subject matter of this report and the petition?
Ms Terrelink.
Through you, Mayor, I believe that advice was previously provided by the Executive Manager of Governance Legal around the freedom of speech aspects and the approach that the city takes in terms of managing signage in the public realm, particularly as it relates to election signage. So certainly the approach is signs are impounded if they are, and removed and then impounded if they are considered to be a safety risk to the community. An education approach is then taken in terms of the remainder of the signs, and we do also do some education prior to elections in terms of advising candidates of the requirements of the city's current signs local law.
Thank you, Ms Terrelink. Third question for you. Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I've been keeping my powder dry so far this evening. It also appears that there is still work to be done in terms of risk tolerance settings from the city's perspective and from administration's, well, from the executive leadership team's perspective as well, around how those risk appetite statements should be interpreted and implemented. If I could just suggest there or foreshadow a potential amendment before next week to look to refer this matter to the next Audit and Risk Committee to look at dealing with the risk appetite statement and what the council's expectations are in terms of risk setting for this particular situation as well.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Treby. Councillor Baker, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor, if I can. My question is addressed to Ms Terrelink. Debbie, given that the clear gravamen of the petition was in effect a complaint about election candidates and election signage, that specifically, not what I say candidates, local government candidates, because the petition makes reference to the October 23 elections. I'm not aware of a state or federal election being held then, but anyhow. And also given that the recommendation is that the request in the petition will be considered in the context of a review being undertaken by the city in relation to signage of this kind, would you consider including in such review a consideration as to the idea of making election candidates strictly liable for the placement of their signs, or in the alternative, reversing the onus of proof, whereby a candidate has to disprove to the city's satisfaction that they placed or caused an election campaign sign to be placed, please?
Ms Terrelink.
Through you, Mayor, yes, that can certainly be included as part of the review.
Councillor Sangalli.
Just noting that this review won't occur before the next election, and the next election is a mayoral election, which means there will be a high amount of interest and probably a high amount of candidates. So we will likely have a lot of signs going out on verges and possibly in places that they shouldn't go. We spoke about education prior to the election before. in that education, are we going to be telling candidates that we actually won't find them? Because sitting around this table right now, we all know that, but new candidates who are not part of local government now have traditionally gone in under the threat that there is potentially fines for having signs in the wrong place. So are we going to be upfront and tell those candidates that until we review this, we won't be fining them?
Ms Terralink?
Through you, Mayor, I think the letter that's sent out is actually sent out through the under the Director of Planning and Sustainability, because that's where the science local law sits. I would need to refer to him as to whether that would be included into the letter as well. I do know that we have received advice from Main Roads about what their policy is with signage on the main roads, which we will be including as part of the communication in the upcoming elections.
Mr CEO would like to speak to this item.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Mayor. I think one of the issues that this item has highlighted is the fact that we will be going into the next local government elections with the current local law in place. Council has a policy that relates predominantly to planning and sustainability, which concerns compliance should be achieved first prior to legal action, but doesn't provide clarity in terms of infringement, which I think some elected members have raised this evening. So the proposal for the executive to look at some, I guess, more operational risk statements on how administration will go about enforcing the current drafted and adopted local law prior to the next election will allow us to provide some guidance to audit risk about some options of how administration could align and enforce the current local law aligned to council's adopted strategic risk statements. That then will provide an opportunity to discuss and review that at the right level, bearing in mind that council would want to be involved at the high level of local law enforcement, aligned to policy, and then my role as chief executive will be to determine how to administer council's local laws.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Any more questions on this item? Yes, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. I just had one general question. For local laws, is there any way that we can add a clause to sort of like they do with the Act and regulations? Is there any mechanism for us so we don't have to go through the gazettal process when changing, say if we change infringements and stuff like that? Is there any current process that we could add a clause in it to have certain regulations under that local law, for example?
Mr CEO?
No, unfortunately, it's a very structured approach. Certainly, more contemporary local laws in terms of infringement value will talk about a unit, and then the unit can then be determined from time to time, and then that cascades through the local laws. But no, unfortunately, as we see from one of the other items this evening, it's a very structured approach.
Any further questions on this item? If there are no further questions on this item, thank you, Ms Terralink. And we move to corporate strategy and performance. Ms Jennings. Ms Jennings.
Good evening, Mayor and Councillors. There are two items here on this part of the agenda this evening, so I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions on item 4.7? Yes, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. In regards to item 4.7, on the recommendation page and a few pages before that, there's reference to a strategic land purchase 2301 pending the presentation of a report to Council with detailed costings later in 2022. Is this 2022 an error that is supposed to be 2023?
Ms Jennings.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just trying to get to that page, but if it says 22, yes, that should say 23. You do have a briefing note now available for you on the hub, but essentially the idea is that this is to put some money aside for a deposit should we have a property come up that is of interest. So, because otherwise we haven't got any money ready to actually execute. So that's what we're doing here in moving some money from strategic land into a project number.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Councillor Wright.
I suppose you sort of answered my second question. I'll ask it anyway. Why are we being asked to allocate a budget without hearing the presentation and information first? I know that you've just mentioned the briefing note, which I had a very quick look at prior to the meeting, which was uploaded around 4:30. Is it usually this practice for that, considering we're voting on it, or asking questions tonight and then voting on it next week?
Ms Jennings.
Through the chair, as I mentioned, could be for any parcel of land. So it's just that we probably didn't think it through at the start that we needed a bit of money in actually a project to be able to actually execute anything. So this is just a change to move from the Strategic Land Reserve, which we have agreed at Revenue Review Committee to be the source of some funds should we buy a piece of land. However, just to be able to prepare ourselves for when a piece of land is available for us that we all agree to, then we've got some money there for a deposit.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Councillor Rowe.
Thanks, Mayor. Just one question on page 218 that deals with fees and charges. Director, is it possible before next week, if you don't have the explanation now, just to explain the lower booking fee incomes and the lower user entry fees at our indoor stadium and Aquamotion? Looking at that figure, I was wondering if it was a seasonal pattern or if the facility was not available for booking for a period of time. So perhaps before next week, if there's any way that we can explain the variance that was produced there.
Thank you, Ms Jennings.
And thank you. Through the chair, it is for January, so I suspect it is a seasonal issue because of school holidays. However, I will go through and double check that for you and have an answer through to all council members.
Are there any further questions on item 4.7? There are no further yes, Councillor Smith.
Thank you. To the Director, with the delay in receipt of greens fees income and driving range income of 100,000 from golf course, just wondering if that is short-term, medium-term, long-term, in terms of if we know when that might come in.
Ms Jennings.
Through the chair, that is short-term. It's partly to do with the transition of golf management, so the fees are coming in a slightly different way. So it will gradually right itself as we reset which part is revenue that'll be different from what maybe we originally budgeted, but there'll be expenditure that's different as well.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Any other questions? Yes, Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through the chair to Ms Jennings. I refer to dot point number, just bear with me, I apologise. Yes, dot point, or the second last dot point at the top of 218. There's reference to an explanation for the unfavourable variance of $612,000 to, amongst other things, unfavourable parking fine income of $16,000. Is it the case that unpaid parking fines can be registered under the Fines Enforcement Infringement legislation, and therefore, of course, impact upon motorists' ability to drive? In other words, can they be used, can they be registered, and can they result in the suspension for unpaid fines of a motor vehicle licence, please?
Ms Jennings.
Through the chair, they can. However, this is about the actual income for January. So, again, it's holiday period, so it might just be showing that there's maybe less than a normal month.
Ms Jennings, I'd just like to ask, would it be maybe that the residents were doing well and not parking badly, so there weren't so many fines?
Through the chair, certainly there's a group doing much better in January, yes.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Councillor Nguyen, do you have a question?
Yes, just in relation to the two mobile CCTV towers, that's the cost of $90,000. Is that just the acquisition cost, or is that the lifetime cost of the two new towers? And
Ms.
if so, what
Jennings?
is the lifetime cost of each?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm not sure which page that is, but I do know there was a purchase of two new, so that would be capital. But if you could let me know the page, I can confirm.
228. second last paragraph.
Yes, through the chair, that is the capital, so that is new towers being purchased.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Are there any other questions to this item?
Sorry, what was the...
Do you have another question, Councillor Nguyen?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Okay, ask your question.
What was the lifetime cost? What will be the lifetime cost?
Ms
of each tower?
Jennings?
Thank you, Mayor. I'll have to take that on notice because I haven't seen the actual whole purchase price. But that's its purchase price to start with, but its lifetime costs I'll have to look into. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Are there any other questions on this item? If there are no more questions, I'll move on to item 4.8, the consideration of minutes and decisions of the electors' annual general meeting held on the 7th of February 2023. Are there any questions on this item? Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through the chair to Ms Jennings, I refer to paragraph 7 on page 240 of the agenda, and it states quite correctly that this is in relation to decision number 2 at the AGM of electors. That paragraph states quite correctly that the council is not obliged to report on either council member attendances at conferences, seminars, etc., or provide details of the cost of them so attending. That is the case the council isn't, but isn't the case that under our Code of Conduct, council laws, who are elected by for their fellow elected members to be their delegates, or to be the city's delegates, or a delegate or representative at a third-party conference or seminar or body, that they are required under the code to submit a report to council reporting on what transpired at the relevant conference or seminar or third-party meeting, please.
Ms Jennings?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just trying to catch up with which paragraph that is. Sorry.
It's page 240. The paragraphs are not numbered. I'm using the generic paragraph numbering system. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It starts with the words, opens with the words, the council is not obliged to report on either, hyphen. The council is not obliged to report on either. 240.
So this question was about the type and the amount of value of any fees, expenses or allowances paid. So when you're talking about report, you mean actually reporting about the conference rather than the report the way it's mentioned in this particular clause?
Yes. Well, that's just it. The report says that the council, the City of Wanneroo, is not obliged to report on either councillor members' attendances at conferences, etc., or the cost of their attendances, etc. That is the case in terms of the council. But certainly the council laws, the individual elected members who attend a third-party entity meeting in their capacity as a delegate of the city or representative of the city, under our Code of Conduct, they are required to provide a written report to their fellow elected members.
Ms Jennings,
so there is a there would be obviously
can I just clarify? The question F that this responds to is about the amount of value of any fees, expenses or allowances paid to each council member during the financial year beginning or after 1st of July 2020, and it is not relevant and makes no mention of each councillor bringing a report. So you are actually responding to the question at the annual general electors, and there was no reason to respond to anything else because that wasn't asked. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mayor. So I think the word report, we're looking at it differently. So this is about us reporting on costs, which is different from maybe writing a report.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Councillor Baker, do you have another question?
Yes, just by further particulars. Decision 2, this report that I'm dealing with, this aspect is in response to Decision 2 that was carried. It reads that attendance by elected members to conferences be presented to Ordinary Council in a report followed by a report advising what was gained by attending the conference.
Where is that in this report? I can't see that.
Page 239. If you scroll down the page, you'll see Decision 1 carried, some notes, and underneath that you'll see heading Decision 2 -carried. Page 239. The paper version's easier to manipulate, of course.
Okay, so you were quoting the wrong question when you were looking at page 240 instead of back at 239 where there was a different question.
No, the city's response to Decision 2 starts midway down page 239 and continues to the following numerical page, which is 240. So the commentary that I quoted from earlier, it deals with the city's response to the decision 2 being carried and what decision 2 said. I'm not sure if you can follow that, please, madam. You'll see, for example...
Thank you. Ms Jennings, would you like to respond to that? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I mean, this part on page 239 does go through the various parts of the Act and training, etc. The report on training, that's about the report we have on the website about training. Yeah, I mean, it's a very thorough answer. So I think we may be getting confused about what a report is, but I'm happy to go through it with Councillor Baker separately, just to go through each part.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Do I have another question on this item? Yes, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. My questions are in regard to Decision 7. The report says the sustainability outcomes are found in the annual report. I had a look at the annual report and it gives a very small table on page 112 outlining energy consumption, groundwater licence allocations and native vegetation percentages. Nothing that goes into details about carbon emissions, the city's assets and fleets, which is mentioned in the report around the 3 categories that it's split into. Administration has provided no dashboard for public view on the city's website, which are further objectives I believe the electors are wanting more accountability around metrics. City of Canning and Perth examples. Is there any comment in regards to why administration has decided to just note this rather than expand on the current metrics in both our annual report and on the city's website?
Ms Jennings.
Thank you, Mayor. This is certainly a work in progress area for us, and I know that the Planning Sustainability Group has also got a climate change, which includes measures that we're using, for example, for fleet emissions, etc. So what we've stated here is what we do have, but we will be reviewing some of those reports and then increasing our types and depth of KPIs in the future. And I think it's relatively soon that we have to review that report. I might just check with the Director of Planning Sustainability, if I may.
Ms Dixon, Mr Dixon, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, and through you, Mayor. So within the climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy, there are targets that have been set, and we are proactively working towards achieving those targets. We can look at providing more information on the city's website in terms of how we're tracking in terms of progress against those targets.
Thank you, Mr Dixon. Yes, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. I thank Mr Director Dixon for those answers. If that's the case, and going off Ms Jennings' preamble before the Director spoke, wouldn't it be more appropriate for Decision 7 to be support the metrics then and tie that in with the current existing reviews of the climate change strategy? Because the actual recommendation for the city's sustainable energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, I think from what you just said is appropriate, which seems to be in line with the climate strategy. Because currently I don't think any of those targets we've set in that report are actually reported in the annual report, from my knowledge.
Ms Jennings.
Thank you, Mayor. We do have a section that we have some sustainability measures in, so I can check which pages they are in the annual report. But I'll discuss with the Director about whether we need to have a review of the actual recommendation for that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Any other questions on this item? Yes, Councillor Sangali.
Just noting the recommendation on the council members' attendance, and I just noticed it's got supports the details including appropriate costs rather than total costs. And I'm just wondering whether or not we can actually include total costs, because there is a perception out there that half the time we're eating and drinking more than what the actual cost of the conference is. So I would like the entire cost to be published.
Ms Jennings?
Thank you, Mayor. The reason we've put appropriate costs is just because the way we actually cost information is only to a certain level. So we'll certainly have total costs, but whether we're down to, you know, every cup of tea or something will be difficult. We just don't have that level of granularity in the information.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Are there any other questions on this item? If there are no other questions, I'll move to the next item, which is the Chief Executive Office, Advocacy and Economic Development.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Mr CEO.
Of the reports presented this evening to the briefing session, Mr Marmion would like to briefly introduce 4.9. 4.10 has come on the recommendation from Audit and Risk. 4.11 seeks to formalise some extensions of some council policies, and 4.12 is flowing from a previous workshop with council. So happy to have Mr Marmion introduce 4.9 and take questions on the remaining items.
Mr Marmion.
Thank you, Mayor Aitken. Yes, we have one report from Advocacy and Economic Development. It's a short report on a proposed ALGA motion for the 2023 National General Assembly. Just a little bit of background perhaps. There are 13 growth area Perth and Peel member councils that have been working for about 4 years on quite a lengthy process to satisfy the Infrastructure Australia requirements to develop a business case for regional sporting facilities program. Unfortunately, we received news from Infrastructure Australia that the board resolved that they weren't going to assess that business case after our 4 years of work. So this is just one way of trying to garner some support from our other local government, fellow local governments, to try to put some pressure on the federal government to allow us to have that business case to be properly assessed by Infrastructure Australia as it deserves, and also to continue to provide appropriate level of funding to support local governments in the delivery of identified priority sporting facilities. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr Marmion. Mr CEO wants to speak to this as well.
Thank you, Mayor. I think this ties in quite nicely to a question Councillor Baker raised earlier about the details that are provided when our grant applications for CES RFF aren't successful. This item really seeks to involve Infrastructure Australia through ALGA's advocacy efforts, because we are talking about, for growth councils in Western Australia, pieces of sporting infrastructure that could be 200 million plus. So whilst the state fund is not adequately servicing district and local sporting facilities in Western Australia, we are needing to create a policy position through recognition of Infrastructure Australia that the funding of regional sporting infrastructure for growth councils in Western Australia is a national significant issue that IA should be considering, hence why we're seeking to engage ALGA as the peak advocacy agency for national local government to seek IA to be able to reconsider this important piece of infrastructure classification.
Thank you, Mr Sims. Do I have any questions on this item? Yes, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. It's really good that we're utilising our ALGA motions. So in the report, it mentions a proposed program of works with GAP member councils. Why hasn't council members seen this as a member council?
Mr CEO.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Look, I'd be happy to provide some dates and examples of how council's been briefed previously in regards to GAP work on this specific item.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. How much does the city pay for GAP membership, and what are the current protocols in place around communication of this information to council members? I know previously I've requested multiple agendas and minutes and documents, and if as a member council we pay these fees, council members should be entitled to request this information and provide us information on this. So could I get some more clarification from the CEO?
Mr CEO.
Thank you, Mayor. I am mindful that this item purely relates to an ALGA item, as opposed to general matters to do with WALGA or GAP, but I'm happy to provide examples of the regular updates I provide to elected members each month through the Wanneroo wrap of the policy items discussed at each GAP meeting, and happy to provide further details on the cost associated with WALGA's membership in GAP.
Mr CEO, I think you've already provided that through our previous wrap as well, haven't you?
Through you, Mayor, I'm confident that regular updates have been provided through the Wanneroo wrap to elected members from each GAP meeting. What I'm not sure of is we would disclose through the budget process the cost of WALGA's membership and the associated annual membership to GAP, but I haven't provided that through the Wanneroo wrap.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions on this item? Yes, Councillor Parker.
Did we get any feedback, or all of the groups get any feedback as to why Infrastructure Australia did not want to continue this business case or assess the business case?
Mr Marmion.
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mayor. Basically, there was a review done of Infrastructure Australia, so unfortunately, the timing of that review didn't go so well for us, and their remit changed pretty much late last year, really literally a week after we submitted our final business case. So we were informed in February as a result of that. That's why they weren't going to assess it. So quite disappointing.
Do we have any other questions on this item? If there are no more questions on this item, we go to item 4.10. Do we have any questions on annual compliance audit? Yes, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. I have one question about the area of non-compliance. I've noticed this has happened more than twice in a row now, with the same comment being provided in last year's annual compliance report. Can the CEO ensure Council that this won't happen again in the new year, as the timeframes for these statutory returns are quite generous?
Mr CEO.
Thank you, Mayor. No, I can't. But I can assure Council that there are systems and processes in place within the organisation to ensure officers and elected members are aware of their obligations, and there are systems to follow up, but I can't provide a categoric affirmation as CEO that I can control the actions of each officer or elected member to comply with the guidelines or procedures that are in place.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Any more questions on that item? Yes, Councillor Nguyen.
Do we know the extent of the delay? Was this just a short period, or was that quite lengthy for those two particular person?
Mr CEO. I think it's in the report.
It'd be in the report. I'd have to look at the actual individual cases to get more detail than what's in the report.
Thank you. Any more questions on this item? If there are no more questions, I move to item 4.11, review and extension of review dates for council policies. Do I have any questions on that item? Yes, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. My main concerns are around the financial hardship policy, the amended version. A few of the track changes indicate a removal of the CEO's discretion to waive the $30 admin fee and the prohibition of late payment interest charges. Why is this the case when we have a very bad cost of living crisis and lots of residents facing hardship? Is that required by this state government that we have to remove that section, or has this been a decision from the administration?
Ms Jennings, would you be able to respond to that?
Thank you. Through the chair, I understand that this was to do with the repeal of I've forgotten exactly what it's called, but it was a special act that came in for COVID, and so that has now been removed.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Councillor Wright.
So just to ask clarification on Ms Jennings' answer just then, so it's the state government that's added that provision in for local councils to be able to delegate that to the CEO to remove that $30 fee.
Ms Jennings?
If I can just take that on notice and just double check that, but certainly the main part was related to the state removing that part of the, I can't remember exactly what it was, whether it was a regulation or an act, but if I can take that on notice and just double check, please.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Do we have any other questions on item 4.11? If there are no more questions, I'll move to item 4.12. Do I have any questions on that item? Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I have several questions, please, if I could direct them to Ms Jennings. If I can, please, Madam Mayor.
You ask your first question, please,
Thank you,
Councillor
Madam Mayor.
Baker.
Yes, thank you, Ms Jennings. Ms Jennings, to the best of your knowledge, since this policy was first approved by the City, which I understand was several years ago, I'm just looking for the approval date. Just a moment. Oh, yeah. I apologise, Madam Mayor. I know time's of the essence.
It was approved in 2014, I think.
The original version was approved in May 2008. But since May 2008, Ms Jennings, are you aware as to whether there have been any successful applications under the terms of this policy, as it presently reads, by either council members or employees, please?
Mr CEO will be responding to that question, Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Mayor. To the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of any application actually being presented to an ordinary council meeting under this policy.
Supplementary.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Councillor Baker.
Yes. Putting aside applications that are received by you and presented to the elected members at a council meeting, have you ever received any application under this policy since it was first passed way back in 2008, please?
Mr CEO.
Look, to answer that comprehensively, I would need to reflect on the file to see if there were any applications.
You can't think of any off the top of your head, so to speak?
I'd need to check the file to see. It's a very long period of time.
Yeah, I understand. Well,
Do you have another question, Councillor
yes,
Baker?
several, Madam Mayor. Please don't rush me. I know you're in a hurry, but please don't rush me. Is it possible
Councillor
actually...
Baker, I'm not in a hurry,
Oh,
but with questions, we don't have preambles or post-ambles. We just want the questions according to the standing orders. Thank you. Councillor Baker?
Yeah, I was going to refer to the agenda item, but I've already given that preamble. But a question to Ms Jennings. The attachment 4 to this report seems, in my view at least, in my interpretation, to be the marked up version of the new legal representation and cost indemnification policy for councils. Is that the case? In other words,
Ms Jennings?
attachment 4 shows the track changes, so you can see the before and after, so to speak.
Mr CEO? I can see that it shows the track changes. I think all of the councillors can see that. Would you agree, Mr CEO?
I think that is the intention, and attachment 3 is the untracked version, which is seeking the adoption next Tuesday night.
That's right. It's just that...
Councillor Baker?
Your question, why is it that the current existing policy in place, that's been in place since 2008 and which is in place as we sit here tonight, why is it that that policy applies to council employees, whereas the new policy excludes council employees? Please.
Mr CEO.
Thank you, Mayor. As explained previously, that is to try to separate the role of council and the role of employees under the Act, and my obligations as Chief Executive to manage the employees under the Act and the policy space that is filled by this policy to deal with elected members' requests. In saying that, it is totally up to council to decide whether to or not to incorporate the staff within the policy, and certainly the departments of local government's model policy includes both. So that is an opportunity for council to further consider if they wished, and that could be referred back to a forum if council wished.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Councillor Baker.
Yes, just to expedite matters, my question is addressed to the CEO. In new clause 6.8 of attachment 4, the heading reads, legal representation and costs indemnification for employees. It states, legal representation and costs indemnification for employees will be dealt with in accordance with the corporate policy, legal representation and cost indemnification for employees. Is that an existing policy? And hence, as we sit here tonight, is there an overlap between the policy we're seeking to amend and that other policy we referred to, the one that specifically refers to employees, please?
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Mr CEO.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Baker, for that question. I'll take that on notice because I need to check with Mr Berkeley here whether that comment is correct or whether that should refer to a different instrument.
I think it requires amending. Also, if I can, another question, please, to Mr CEO.
Yes, Councillor Baker.
I think this is a very important document, Madam Mayor, but anyhow. Look, yes, the definition of legal proceedings in the marked up attachment 4, which is the new proposed policy showing the track changes, defines the term, in inverted commas, legal proceedings, not to include, but to mean proceedings of a legal nature that may be civil, criminal, or investigative. Is an elected member's defence of a Division 4 panel complaint a civil proceeding. My submission it is. I'm just curious what the city's position is. Is it civil, or is it something that's not really civil? It's sort of some nebulous.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Mr.
It does apply
CEO.
civil legal tests.
Thank you, Mayor. My first answer would be I wouldn't envisage that is the case, but I'll take that on notice and seek some further advice.
Thank you, Mr.
Further questions?
CEO. Can I
sum it
pass
up.
to Deputy Mayor Treby, because you've had 6 questions already, and I'll just let Deputy Mayor Treby have a question. Thank you.
Yeah, possibly a bit of a rhetorical question, because I just want to clarify some matters. This has already been presented to a forum, council forum previously. I think it might have been last Tuesday.
Correct.
And just for clarification, because I know that there were a number of...
Point of order, Madam Mayor. I think that's a confidential reference to agenda items at a forum. Agenda items at a forum are confidential. That's my understanding, unless the rules have changed. I have a ruling on the point of order, please.
No, it's not.
It's not confidential.
The question
Would
was...
you like to correct the statement and say that this was discussed previously by council members, and that wouldn't bring up the mention of the agenda at the previous meeting at the forum?
Very well put. It was discussed previously by elected members.
Mr. CEO.
If I could just have 1 second to reflect back on the report. Yes, that is correct.
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Treby, do you have another question?
And broadly in those discussions at that time, when those discussions were held, were there any elected members who didn't avail themselves, who were in attendance?
Point of order, Madam Mayor.
who
That is a
didn't
clear
avail
breach. Point of order. That is a clear breach of the confidentiality provisions and confidentiality attached to forums, agenda
It's not a
forums,
point of order.
forum
He actually
agendas.
hasn't told you what the point of order is.
With respect, I think the elected member may be trying to get around the confidentiality rule, but with respect, I don't think we can even refer
I
to
understand
the
that,
forum.
Councillor Baker, but most of the stuff that comes in reports to the City of Wanneroo has been heavily discussed and brought with previous conversations amongst councillors, and every councillor is given the opportunity to shape and to discuss those items at previous meetings or send it back for further discussion. Deputy Mayor Treby, would you like to perhaps rephrase that question?
Oh, no, I don't think there's any need to rephrase. It certainly wasn't a point of order. There wasn't an aspect of standing orders that was referred to. It was just dissent in the approach for the question. It just, it's unfortunate, I suppose, that in circumstances where elected members seek to avail themselves of all of the relevant information, that in advance of some of the items being discussed, some elected members, for very good reasons more likely than not, may not have made themselves available for those discussions previously.
Like to make that a question?
I think that might be a statement.
Is it my understanding?
Thank you. Councillor Baker, would you like to ask another question?
Yes, I've got a couple more, Madam Mayor. Madam Mayor, this policy, well, according to the policy before us tonight, the current existing policy, this policy was last reviewed in May 2016. Has it been reviewed since then in any manner? Or is this opportunity now tonight the first opportunity in open chambers with members of the public being able to view in and listen in? Is this the first opportunity to be discussed in public, please?
Mr. CEO?
Thank you, Mayor. This policy has been subject to several discussions over an extended period of time at council forums. Council forums are designed to enable council to have input and shape and frame policies that then follow their way to ordinary council meetings. I'll have to look back on the exact dates.
Sure. Are there any other questions, ma'am? Perhaps I should let other members ask questions. I can see quite a few.
Are there any other
trying to raise their
questions
hands.
around the chamber? Yes, Councillor Rowe.
I don't know if the CEO can provide specific information, but I can recall this coming before a public agenda of council. I believe it was last year, and there being some concern around the table, so it was pushed back more than 12 months at this stage. So I remember it coming to public session of council. The question is that the case?
Mr CEO.
Thank you, Mayor. I can't specifically recall, but that would be correct with council procedure in that council makes policies. Policies are workshopped through forums, and if policies aren't where council needs them to be when presented to an ordinary council meeting, then they are at times referred back for further work through a forum.
Could we please, Mr CEO, also check if when it was brought 12 months ago to council, the reason why it was returned to further discussion? Because if I remember correctly, it was because it was thought not appropriate to have the same policy for elected members and staff, and it was thought it might need to be reviewed and separate legal representation under different rules, because elected members are under a different code and a different responsibility to employees who sit under the authority and operational responsibility of the CEO. And that might be what we discussed 12 months ago, and that's what it was sent back to be reformatted. Could you please check that for me, please?
Yes, Mayor.
Thank you. Do I have any other questions? Councillor Sangali.
I do have a question just on the definitions. So on page 308, under key definitions, point 3, council member means a current or former council member, commissioner or non-council member of a council committee. Can I get an example of who a non-council member of a council committee would be that we would be defending?
Mr CEO.
I can't think of one myself, but I think the Director of Corporate Strategy and Performance has something to add.
Ms Jennings.
Thank you. Perhaps I can use an example, although we actually haven't implemented it, but we may have an independent person on our Audit and Risk Committee, for example.
Thank you, Ms Jennings. Councillor Sangali.
I guess the other question I have, being that we're talking about committees, is internally we have committees where our staff are actually members of committee. So do they then fall under this policy, or do they fall under a staff policy?
Mr CEO.
I would consider them under their employment contract and our other instruments that deal with staff's advice and representation through committees.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Any other questions on this item? Yes, Councillor Baker.
Yes, just in relation to that question of third-party non-elected members being the subject of the new proposed policy. Remember, this is not the existing policy. Is it the case, Mr CEO, that many terms of reference for community working groups or committees contain a provision to the effect that it's possible for that working group or committee to co-opt a member of the public because there's special expertise in a particular area which is relevant and before the relevant committee? Isn't it the case that they would also be, isn't it the case that the standard terms of reference do have such a power? I think the answer is yes.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Mr CEO.
Look, I would need to refer to our standard terms of reference, but I'm sure there is an opportunity for expertise to be co-opted into a working group for specific advice.
Councillor Baker.
Yes, just a question, a couple more questions. Why is it that this policy does not provide for a means test to be applied to elected members seeking ratepayers' money to, amongst other things, potentially conduct defamation actions or defend defamation actions? Why is it not means tested? We hardship test ratepayers who are having trouble paying their rates on time, their instalments on time. Surely the fundamental starting point is a means test. Even the Legal Aid Commission applies that test. That should be the fundamental starting point. There has to be a means test. We applied that means test to businesses, small businesses during COVID, when they were seeking relief from the payment of rates and fees and charges. Why is this not means tested? If, for example, Gina Reinhardt becomes a member of this council after October...
Thank you, Councillor Baker.
We have to fund her legal
Mr
fees.
CEO, would you like
case.
to respond to that? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Policies can be what council wishes them to be. This policy is heavily influenced by the model policy from the Department of Local Government. But these questions are more questions that council would consider than, as Chief Executive Officer, I would consider.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Councillor Baker.
Yes, I was just referring to the contents of the policy. There's no provision for a means test in the policy. That's the point. The other point too is, as I said, if, for example, an elected member sues another elected member or sues a member of the public for defamation, is successful and gets a costs order, then that elected member will have to reimburse any costs that the city has paid up front to assist or financially aid that elected member in those proceedings. In effect, if that is the case, and that is allowed for in 6.6, the city is in effect a banker. It's lending 20 grand on conditions. If the elected member is successful in the case, and that may be 3 or 4 years later, they have to pay their 20 grand if there's a cost order that's paid out.
Mr CEO.
No interest is payable. We're acting as a banker in those circumstances.
Mr CEO, would you like to respond to that item?
Thank you, Mayor. The policy is written exactly in that way, that there is an opportunity for council to seek recovery of costs if they are awarded through the court.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Councillor Baker.
Yes, and just in terms of the circumstances in which the city can seek reimbursement of costs, the money's paid on behalf of the elected member in respect of defending or prosecuting civil proceedings or what have you. That's dealt with in clause 6.6 of the new marked up version, attachment 4, and it lists the circumstances in which a council member whose legal representation costs have been paid by the city is to repay to the city. Subclause A says, all or part of the legal costs in accordance with a determination made by the council under clause 6.4.6. If you look at 6.4.6, it says that, in a nutshell, a council may determine that the member who is making an application for the costs has, in respect of that matter, in which costs were approved, has not acted in good faith or has acted unlawfully, etc., corruptly, etc., was given false information. So they're the grounds that are imported in 6.6.1. And the last one is B. As much of the legal representation costs are available to be paid as a set-off or the council member receives money paid for legal fees, costs, etc. Now, I'm not concerned with that last mentioned clause. Obviously, if the elected member is successful, he gets a costs order which covers basically all his costs, or generally normally around 70%.
What is the question, Councillor Baker?
Yes. It doesn't actually state whether or not the funds are to be paid if the elected member is unsuccessful for legal reasons, unsuccessful in those proceedings, in terms of either prosecuting the proceedings or defending them.
Okay,
it does
Mr.
refer to
CEO,
several.
would you like to take that on notice?
I could give a hypothetical factual scenario that perhaps assist members.
Madam Mayor, I think the policy is drafted in a way that deals with these matters. I think if Councillor Baker or any councillor has a different alternative wording or clause, then that would be an appropriate amendment to move to the policy.
Well, if I can, if that is the case,
Councillor Baker?
Yes, if that is the case, Madam Mayor, to responding to what the CEO said, I will propose to move an amendment in that respect or regard, because I'm aware of many cases where, for example, the city itself has acted in good faith, etc., acted lawfully, acted properly, acted correctly, not given false information, and they've been successful. So even if the city itself applied under this policy, which it can't, it would not be entitled to have its costs recovered if it was unsuccessful.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. You have foreshadowed an amendment. Do you have any other questions? There are no more questions. We'll move to item 4.
Could you give me more than a nanosecond to respond to that question, please, Madam Mayor, if I can? Is it, in terms of the agreement as well referred to in the new proposed new policy, 6.7, that agreement refers to a legal agreement being entered into between the city and the elected member. That legal agreement, I assume, would contain the usual security provisions, such as the right of the city to caveat the title in respect of any land, well, in WA or the Commonwealth of Australia's territories, in which the elected member has an interest. That's a common, very simple way of securing the repayment of the legal fees, just in the off chance that the elected member is unsuccessful in prosecuting.
Is that a question, Councillor Baker?
Yes.
What's the question?
What's the question?
Yeah, it sounded like a statement, not a question.
Well, I'll repeat it slowly. Clause 6.7 of the proposed new policy has a heading. The heading reads, entrance into agreement.
That's correct.
It reads, any applicant must enter into a legal agreement with the city addressing the requirements of this policy prior to any legal representation costs being, it says, being made. I think that means paid.
Made.
That agreement, I assume, would also contain a clause which it authorises the city to register a caveat on the title in respect of any land in the Commonwealth of Australia or its territories, in respect of which the elected member seeking the financial representation cost payment has an interest. In other words, there would be security, not just a mere agreement.
So you want a caveat over the elected members' property?
No, I'm asking, what I'm saying is that there should be security clauses within that legal agreement, rather than saying a legal agreement such as I promise to pay. That it should be a proper security style legal agreement, rather than a mere undertaking to repay.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Baker, for the question. There is some administrative arrangements that go with every policy. So Council sets the strategic policy and intent, and then as Chief Executive, I look at the instruments that are required to achieve the outcome within the policy. I think these discussions and comments from Councillor Baker relate more to those instruments that ensure security over any agreement that's entered into under the policy.
I wasn't aware of those. Is it possible to get a copy of those management procedures, please? The document titled management procedure, please.
They are operational, but Mr CEO?
Oh, that's why we can't get those.
Thank you, Mayor. Can I suggest,
Maybe
I think,
FOI?
first of all, it's important that as Chief Executive, I understand where Council's policy direction is. Once I've understood that, and I can only understand that for an adoption of a policy, then it is the opportune time then to cast your mind to what are the instruments that enable the policy to be administered.
Thank you, Mr CEO. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Mayor. On page 320, 6.7, the entrance into agreement, and 6.8, which also refers to the employees part of it as well. If any applicant, which would be a council member, non-committee member, employee, for example, entered into a legal agreement with the city, under section 5.92 of the Act, any council member can have access to any information held by the local government without limiting subsection 1. A council member can have access to all written contracts entered into by the local government. So does that mean I can go requesting employees that have accessed refunds for legal fee reimbursements? Does that mean I can go and see if Councillor Baker's requested anything as an individual elected member? Because it doesn't say anything around...
I can answer that question, save you an FOI fee. The answer is no,
Baker,
no and never.
Councillor Baker, Mr CEO, would you like to take that question on notice?
Perhaps I can answer it in one answer and take part on notice. First of all, when it comes with dealing with access for information, there are several sections and elements within the Act that need to be read together with other elements of the Act. And perhaps I can just reiterate that this is a council policy. We provide opportunities for council to discuss and examine policy prior to coming to a briefing in an ordinary council meeting. It's important for the staff of the City of Wanneroo to be provided with an environment which enables a discussion to be occurred and then provide the feedback to council. I think if there are more questions relating to this policy, it would be more appropriate to refer it back to a forum where the city staff have a chance to understand further comments and concerns from council and adequate time to consider and answer those.
Deputy Mayor Trevey, would you like to move it back to a forum, move this policy then? Oh, no, we have to do the decision-making process.
Yes, that's
in the
right.
council meeting, sorry.
I'm more than happy to foreshadow that next week, unless the administration seeks to withdraw the report.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Treby. So we will close discussion on this. No, we're closing discussion on this item because we have a plan of what will be happening.
But you cannot move a motion at a briefing session.
Mr CEO.
Madam Mayor, thank you for the opportunity. I think as
Councillor Baker, could you please be quiet while the CEO is speaking? I have given the CEO the floor. Please do not talk in the background while other people are speaking.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think as Councillor Baker alluded to at the beginning of the briefing session, this is indeed a very important policy for Council. It is a policy that needs to be shaped by Council with due respect to the Department of Local Government's template policy. There is still and remains considerable conversation and questions in regards to the proposed policy. We already have a policy in place, so there is no concern for Council to be without a policy because there is already an adopted policy in place. So based on that, I will refer the matter back to a future forum and not have it presented next week.
Thank you, Mr CEO. On that, I move
Mayor, I've waited patiently to ask my questions and you've not allowed me the opportunity to ask questions on this item at all.
Councillor Nguyen, you can ask the questions when it's brought back within the council discussion to a forum, because the discussion is closed on this because the item has now been withdrawn. Moving on to item 4, motions on notice, we have none. Item 5, there's nothing to be tabled at the briefing. Item 6, public question time, there's no community in there. Item 7, we have 2 confidential items. Does anyone want to discuss either 8.1 or 8.2? Okay, then we need to move behind closed
not to
doors because
discuss.
these are confidential.
Not to discuss, just
Councillor Wright, what is your, do you want to discuss these items confidentially?
I just had a general question without mentioning any specifics in the report. Was there any reason why this report was brought to us as a confidential item rather than just this section of the legal advice?
Can we close the doors? We'll move to closed doors now, please.
I think you might need a motion.
What's the date of the next meeting? Oh, I've got it, 21st of March. The date of the next meeting is Tuesday, 6 p.m, 21st of March 2023, to be held at the Council Chambers, Civic Centre, 23 Dundebar Road, Wanneroo, and I declare this meeting closed at 7:57. Thank you.